You're listening to Kill Cliff's Hazard Ground podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's guest, a Air Force combat controller, super excited for this story. If you guys have heard us tell stories about Air Force PJs, pararescuemen jumpers, this is kind of like right in that same ilk. So super excited for that. We'll get to that coming up here in just a moment. Just a reminder about leaving us some Apple reviews. We were doing some research this week. Found out we get reviews from all over the world, folks. So keep them coming. They're great. They're fantastic. We certainly appreciate them. And it's helping us grow this podcast and try to crack the top 100 Apple podcasts. So not only tell a friend, but leave a review wherever you get your Apple podcast. Give us 5 stars. Tell us why you love the show. And if you're lucky, only if you're lucky, we'll post it here on our social media accounts where you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast. Keep up with the show and everything we have going on. Of course, don't forget about our promotion with Amazon. You can go to our website, hazardground.com, and click on the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage or under the sponsors tab. You get to do all of your normal Amazon shopping. We get a percentage of what you guys spend, and then we donate a percentage back to some of the charities and organizations featured here on the Hazard Ground. Also works from your smartphone, very simple, directs you right to the app. So that way all your credit card information is saved. And as a matter of fact, I'll pull the curtains back. I had to yell at my wife. She did Christmas shopping already on Amazon and did not go to hazardground.com. It was a big source of consternation in the Zinno family. So she's going to get a mouthful. But please, as you get ready for Amazon shopping, holiday shopping, go to hazardground.com first. All right, on to this week's guest, who has spent 24 years in the United States Air Force as a combat controller. He's deployed all over the world, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Bosnia, Angola, including 4 combat jumps, 1 in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan, which is a rare accomplishment in the SOF community. He retired as a Chief Master Sergeant and is currently the president of the board of both the CCA, the Combat Controller Association, and the Combat Controller Foundation. He is Michael Lamonica joining us here on the Hazard Ground. Michael, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here.
Also interesting to note, you actually had the pleasure of serving with and being a personal friend of the late Master Sergeant John Chapman, who was the combat controller who was killed in Afghanistan, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor during Roberts Ridge, aka Takur Gar, a story that we've told several times here on the podcast. So just sort of another connection between the podcast and your service altogether.
Yeah, no, thank you. John and I were on the team together when he unfortunately passed. And then I've got a great relationship with his family. And then Dan Schilling and Laurie Chapman, who wrote the book, there's a real close connection there as well. So John's always an interesting subject to discuss because he's such a hero.
Yeah. And Dan, part of the Black Hawk Down mission in Mogadishu, right. Which a story, we've had like 12 or 15 people, and we've never been able to have Dan. So maybe you could tell Dan to jump on the Hazard Ground with us. We'd love to hear his story as well. But we always like to start with our guests with their story and your story back at the beginning. 24 years in the Air Force. Where and why and how did it start?
Yeah, it was interesting. I joined the Air Force. It was really a way to get away and go be myself, right? I always felt like I had something to do. And as I was growing up, people in the military just had this thing about them that I admired. So I went, man, I got to go do something. And while I was in basic training, I heard about combat control. And, I just went and tried out. I quite frankly didn't think I'd have much of a shot at it, but I passed the test. An interesting anecdote is that the night before class started, they had us all in a room. And the instructors were talking about what we can expect. And, they said, hey, out of the 100 of you that are sitting here, 5 of you are going to make it. And the lead instructor looked around the room and he goes, Lamonica, you're not one of them. And that kind of made me a person that people didn't want to be around. A lot of people avoided me. But the really interesting thing about that story are a handful of guys did come up to me and talk to me after that. And to a man, everybody who came up and said, don't worry about that. Let's move out. We're a team. Those are the guys who graduated. We graduated 15 guys out of that class, and they're all still very good friends today.
That's awesome. What year was this when you enlisted?
1987. So I joined August 12th, 1987, and went to basic training. And then this time that year is when I was going through the NDOC course there on Lackland Air Force Base.
I mean, how did you hear about it? Because again, the SOF community, the special operations community, especially back then, it wasn't as common knowledge as it is now. Like I've always remarked, I remember when I was on active duty and I was on Fort Hood and I was driving down the road, I remember seeing a banner about special operations and, hey, if you're interested, call this number kind of deal. And I always wondered what it was, and I never knew what it was. And of course, this is in a pre 9/11 world. So how did you end up finding out about it? Because I feel like more people might have joined or at least tried to join if we had known about it earlier.
Yeah, no doubt. So, back then we didn't have the internet. We didn't have cell phones. Communication moved at the speed of paper back then. When I was leaving for basic training, my recruiter handed me an airman magazine. It's published every month. And on the front, it had a guy doing exercises, and it was titled Superman University. It was about pararescue. And he said, hey, you may want to look at this. And on the ride to the MEP station, I was looking at it. I went, well, not really something that interests me. It really talked about doing 1,000 push-ups before 9 o'clock in the morning, things like that. And I just wasn't that guy. I was more interested in joining the military and just going and doing the job. While I was in basic training, I found a lot of people weren't really prepared for what they came in for. It was this big emotional trauma for them. And I've been preparing for the military mentally my whole life. So for me, it wasn't quite as bad. And I went to a briefing about combat control pararescue on like the second week while I was there. And while I was there, there were candidates, pararescue and combat control candidates there. And I went, these are the guys I want to be around. I couldn't have told you what a combat controller did at that point. These are the guys I want to be around. So I went and took the test, I passed, and then everything went on from there. So I really heard about it by recruiting in basic training. We've since come light years ahead.
Yeah. What was it about them? Was it the look, just the way they trained? What were you seeing that sort of was the impetus for it?
They were guys who did what they said. They moved with a purpose, and they were there to be there. They weren't there because they wanted to go to college. They weren't there because they were running away from something. They were there because they wanted to be there, and the mission was what was important to them. And that proved out throughout my entire career. Just when you surround yourself with people that are focused, they elevate you. And I can attribute many successes in my life to being around those folks.
Isn't it crazy how in an organization like the military, where everybody is meant to dress the same, look the same, walk the same, talk the same, you could just look at certain people in that uniform and know they're different. They just have that confidence. They exude that sort of whole personality that comes out of them. And yes, the unit itself lends to that, but just in general, you didn't really have conversations with these guys, right? You just saw them.
Yeah, it's well, they were the students who were briefing us and giving us the physical assessments.
Right.
So you were very much interacting with them, and they just moved with a different purpose. It was striking to me. As a matter of fact, when I talked earlier about when I was growing up, people who'd served carried themselves differently. These guys carried themselves like those people that I knew. And foremost in that is my grandfather. My grandfather served in World War II. He was a medic on the front lines there, and he engaged the enemy many times, and he was shot 2 times. And just growing up, he was a guy I admired, and these guys fit that mold. Once I got into the pipeline, I started learning about combat control. I went, okay, this is cool. I'm going to jump out of airplanes. I'm going to scuba dive and all these other things. But it really, most of the people in the military will tell you it's the person to the left of you and person to the right of you that gives you purpose. And for me, that was it from day one.
So after you finish your basic training, how quickly do you get to start going through? Was it back then? Was it still called like assessment? Is that the deal for Air Force combat controllers?
Yeah. No, they didn't. So right at that time, I joined at a very unique time where they merged combat control and pararescue to go through the same pipeline. So I showed up. I graduated in the middle of September from basic training. I showed up to the NDOC course, and they didn't have a prep course back then, but what they did is they had very specific start dates. So if you got there early enough, you had some gap time. There were guys in my class that got there in July, and they had to wait until October for a start. I got there in September, so I had about 4 weeks. And they used that sort of like a prep course at the point because the other students had been there for a while, would teach you how to do stuff. But I was lucky because there was a guy in my class who showed up the night prior. If I'd have showed up the night prior, I wouldn't have made it to that class. I would have gotten rolled back because there was just so much to understand. And I wasn't a physical dynamo. I wasn't a big wrestler or a football player or any of those things in high school. I played baseball, but I needed that extra time. And that's why they built the prep courses for guys like me.
I mean, it's just, it sounds incredible that, you recognized all this so early on that this is what you wanted to do and where it was. And It's crazy because there's a lot of people who don't know if they have the chops to get through a course like that, right? Like, I mean, a lot of guys who enter it think that they do, but clearly with the attrition rate, their body tells them no, their mind tells them no. Um, was there something for you that was like a sole source of motivation in getting through this course?
Well, I think every young man wants to prove himself in a certain way, and for me, that was definitely a motivator. Um, my roommate at the time, his name's Dean Thompson. He also retired as a chief. He and I spent most of our careers together. On the first night of class, after they made the comment about me, most likely not making it, we just looked at each other and said, "I'll quit when you quit." So it was making it day by day. And for me, I woke up. So we would get up at 4 a.m. We would clean the barracks. We would go. We had to run everywhere we went. We would go eat, and we'd come back, and then we would do calisthenics, and we would run to the pool, and then we'd come back and do a little bit of academics. And there were things throughout the day that you were doing, and it was all physical. It was like going through a combine, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I moved event to event. I literally would go, okay, I made it through this event, just make it through the next event. Don't quit, you'll be fine. There was a point during the day where the cadre would leave us alone. It was like a 30-minute time period. And it's funny, I would sit there in my chair because you weren't allowed to do anything. I'd sit in my chair and I'd doze off, and I'd wake up, because it'd be shocking, like, oh my God, I'm still here. And I've got this next thing to go to. And it's almost like this adrenaline rush of fear because you're surviving every day. I don't know anybody who made it through that course, that NDOT course, that went, it wasn't too bad. It was just a tough course. 100 guys start, 15 guys graduate, and they are running you through the gauntlet physically every day, all day. It's all you do.
Yeah, I asked this a lot of SEALs. Was there a part of the course or portion of the course where you could see a guy was about to quit, or you were surprised by somebody who quit, or, you yourself thought you weren't going to make it?
Well, every day for me, I just didn't know if I was going to make it to the next day. What I knew is I wasn't going to quit. Like, it was going to take a lot to make me quit. They were going to have to drag me out of that pool dead. But you could see it in somebody's eyes. And there were a couple times where guys that I thought were they were steel, right? They were hardcore.
Yeah.
The next day they weren't there. And you wouldn't always see somebody quit. Like, I know in the SEAL community, you hear about people ringing the bell. We had a fair amount of that where guys would quit, openly. But we also had a fair amount of guys who, when there was a moment to be by themselves, they would walk up to the cadre hallway, they'd quit. We just wouldn't see them. In the first couple of weeks, it was just, it's truly an attrition event. The first couple of weeks, really, when you lose most of them. The biggest surprise to us is we were down to 16, and we had one of our teammates, he was actually a pararescue trainee. He quit in the middle of the day, and we were all standing outside getting ready to go somewhere. We were all going, "Hey, where's Everett Houston? Where's Everett Houston?" And the cadre looked out and said, "You guys need to press on without him." And that was a bit crushing because we were a really tight team at that point. And I never got to talk to him to understand why he quit, but he did. He was the last person on our team that quit.
I was going to ask you, did you ever get a chance to ask him why? I mean, that's nobody ever tracked him down and figured out?
Well, one of the guys, so he came in on the buddy system. One of the guys on our team, they were like best friends. They grew up together. They were both Eagle Scouts together, as a matter of fact. But we never, like, once the guy was gone, you never heard from him. It was, you were fairly isolated at that point. And then we did have one guy get kicked out afterwards. So he graduated the course, and this guy was a beast. He was a nationally ranked runner. Physically, he was unstoppable. But he had some discipline issues. And the cadre were like, "Hey, yeah, you can be a physical beast, but you also have to be smart, and you also have to be disciplined." And this guy just continually, in the face of instructors, would break rules, and they eliminated him too. So while we graduated 15, only 14 of us made it through the pipeline.
Crazy. All right. So after graduation, what's next for you? Where are you going?
Yeah. So back then, I went straight to jump school. We graduated in December. I went to jump school. And then from there, we went to air traffic control school. I then went to survival school, came back from that. Then we all went to the combat divers qualification course down in Key West. That's run by the Special Forces. Then we went to water survival, which was a really simple 3-day course, but it was a lot of fun. Then I went to combat control school. And so as you look at the difficulties in the pipeline back then, the NDOT course was the big washout. That's where you lost most of your people. Mm-hmm. The next hardest school was the combat divers course down in Key West, and then the combat control school. All three of those were really kind of the pinnacle of fitness there.
I mean, it's what is it, about 2 years worth of school straight through?
It is. It's if you make it. So what I didn't have at that point, I didn't get to go to military pre-fall school till a little bit later. But right now, the course is if you go back to back and you don't wash out of anything or wash back out of anything, it's 2 years, 24 months. It's an incredible pipeline.
It's incredible. So when it's all said and done, like, what are you thinking and feeling? Are you at a point where I'm glad I'm done with school, or what's next? I mean,
Yeah. So it's the pipeline is a marathon of sprints. What I mean by that is you show up to school and you're a dirtbag, right? And you got to go through the evolution of proving yourself at that school that the instructors know you're serious and you can be there and all those things. And it gets a little bit easier as you go through each school. Then you go to your next school and it starts all over again. And each school likes to pride themselves in how difficult they are. Some are more difficult than the others, right? Jump school, not so much difficult. Water survival, not too difficult. Air traffic control school intellectually is a difficult school. They have a high washout rate there. And then the fitness schools, the in-dock combat control school and CDQC, those are just tough courses. And even just a bad day can set you back. So when you graduate, they give you command of blouse, boots, and dawn beret. Man, it's quite an incredible moment. You get to go, all right, I did it. I'm there now. Then you show up at your unit and they remind you, you know just enough to be here. So attach yourself to a good NCO and go learn how to do your job.
just curious about the air traffic controller school, because I think when a lot of our civilians listening to it, and even military people who don't know what the hell that is and what that does, like, could you go in the tower at the airport and direct traffic? Is that similar to what you're doing?
That's exactly it. So the historical job of a combat controller is that. So when you talk about the different people in special operations, right? The Rangers are elite light infantry. Special forces, they are foreign internal defense, strategic reconnaissance, things like that. SEALs are maritime interdiction. They also have strategic reconnaissance. So do the recon guys or MARSOC. For combat control, when we get to where we're going, our job is rooted in air traffic control. So we do long haul communications to keep people informed of what we're doing, and we're talking to airplanes and integrating them into what we're doing. So, in the early days of Afghanistan, what we did for the country was we landed airplanes where airplanes aren't supposed to land, and that allowed us to put forces in on the ground in an asymmetric fashion. And we had people coming in from north and the south, and we basically did a pincer move on Afghanistan, and we made them believe we had more people than we did because we were able to be all over the battlefield at any given time. And then the other thing that we do that people are very well aware of is talking to airplanes and dropping bombs on bad guys. But that's all rooted in our air traffic control background.
Wow. See, things I didn't know that I thought I was supposed to know. So after you finish all the schooling, what's your first duty assignment?
So I was out in Washington State, McCord Air Force Base. It was a great assignment for me. And up there, we had a scuba team, a military freefall team, and a special warfare team, which was really mountain warfare and things like that. And that's the team I was on. And I loved it. It was a great place to be. I was a young guy. I was able to be surrounded by a lot of really good NCOs and learn a lot from them. So it was a great 2-year assignment. And while I was there, I got to go to the Gulf War, and we were attached to I was on a small 3-man team attached to the 3rd Armored Division, and our job was to do resupply, land airplanes where airplanes aren't supposed to be, and drop bombs if necessary.
So that experience when you get to go to the Gulf War, because it was like over so quickly, did you feel like you at that point in time you had actually experienced combat?
I didn't. So, I'll refer back to the people I looked up to as a kid. They were all World War II, Korean War, Vietnam era guys. And when I came back, there was now a bond because we'd all been to war. And my response to them was, I haven't earned it yet. You guys went and fought wars. I was on a camping trip. And I don't want to minimize it. It was dangerous, right? But when you're with the 3rd Armored Division and the 3rd Armored Division is rolling through crushing stuff, you're not in a whole lot of danger.
Right.
There was danger there, but it wasn't like my grandfather in World War II in the mountains of Italy. It was different war.
Were you ever, I mean, I remember as a kid, I was young. I was, barely a teenager when the Gulf War kicked off. But I just remember thinking at that point in time, like, wow, our military kicks ass. Like we are just the best fighting force in the world. Did you realize that at that point in time, how much more advanced we were than people we were fighting?
It was a bit eye-opening. What I think, when I look back on it, the competitive advantage we had there was, we had the moral high ground on the globe. Everybody was behind us. But more importantly, I thought our leaders and, former Chairman of Joint Chiefs Steph Colin-Powell, who just passed this week, they set us up for success. It was very clear what we were going there to do. They had a coalition behind us. They were very methodical in how they were taking the information and making decisions. And then when they decided, we went and did. There wasn't a whole lot of ambiguity. So for me, those were eye-opening things at the national level. I went, wow, this is how it's supposed to work. Because again, I look back on Vietnam, and while we did a lot of good things tactically in Vietnam, it was a bit of a shit show because our national leaders didn't do it so well.
No, it's an excellent point. All right, so after the Gulf War, I mean, in the big picture, you're settling in for about the next decade before anything has to go anywhere. Now, obviously, in the special operations community, you're all over the globe doing things that not many people go about, or know about rather. But so, what is your experience over the next couple of years? Are you back at McChord Air Force Base? Where are you heading next?
Yeah, so from there, I came home from the war, and I'd already had, when I deployed to the Gulf War, I had orders to go to Germany, which was really cool. So I came back, went straight to Germany. And while I was there, is again really cool because nobody can respond to the theater in question like the people who are in theater, right? You have this Joint Special Operations Command, they've got this global mission, and they go everywhere and do all kinds of cool stuff. They still can't respond to what's going on in Europe and Africa as fast as the people that are there. And I was on a small team. We were a detachment. There was probably 14 of us. So we're really close. You're in a foreign country, and that causes you to be even a little more close. And while I was there, I got to do some really neat things that otherwise might not have been able to do.
Like what?
I flew airdrop missions. I flew airdrop missions over Bosnia. And the reason I was on that plane is we understood how to use the oxygen stuff, and they had reporters on the plane as stuff was going out. So I was there really kind of to escort them, but it gave me insight into what was going on into Bosnia. I got recalled one night at like 2 a.m, and within 8 hours, I was on a plane to Somalia. Wow. And it was well before the Black Hawk Down, so I don't want to tie it to Black Hawk Down, but it led into Black Hawk Down. I inserted with a 5-man combat control team and 40 UN Pakistanis into Mogadishu Airport. And we landed, and it was just us, and there was, Pakistani force wasn't that impressive. There were 13-year-olds pointing guns at us. There were people running around on what they call technical vehicles with 50 cals on them. We were almost a joke. The danger to us was unbelievable. But I got to run that airfield for an entire week. And every night we would go and stage off of the USS Tarawa and then come back in the morning and run humanitarian relief. That's a really cool mission to get to do. You're helping people in the country. And ironically, that 40-man Pakistani force, after we left, they're the ones who got ambushed, which then led into the Black Hawk Down event.
Right.
I went back from that after 30 days there and immediately got rolled into a mission in Angola where they were having the first democratic elections in like 30 years. And we were down there to work on airfields and facilitate all that. So really neat ability to respond to things in Africa and go do stuff that is very unique to combat control.
Just out of curiosity, did you get a sense in getting into Mogadishu before it all happened that there was any chance that the events that went down would have went down? Did you get a sense that of anything like that brewing in the mist?
Yeah. So while we were there, it was, again, I would say it's high risk. And the more I look back on it, it was more risky than we thought it was.
Right.
5 combat controllers sitting on an airfield with no security. I mean, it was really just us. We didn't have gunships overhead. We had helicopters that could respond up the Tarawa if we needed them, but they weren't spun up, right? They were just there. And every day, the locals, they would take shots across the airfield. So I wouldn't say they were directly shooting at any individual, but we'd hear the crack come by us. They were letting us know their presence. So when we left and, months later, the Pakistanis got ambushed, it wasn't a big surprise. I was surprised we didn't get into more of that.
All right. So all this is going on through the 90s. I don't want to fast forward too much, but obviously 9/11 comes. You're where and kind of what's your mission, what's your assignment at this point in time?
Yeah. So from Germany, I went to the JSOC compound. That's the tier 1 unit there. I spent 4 years there, and then I went to be an instructor. My last day as an instructor was 9/11. We were actually we were getting a warning order or an op order from the students. They were getting ready to go into the field. And while that was going on, my lead instructor came in and said, "Hey, I need to put this on TV." So he interrupted the briefing. He put it on. We watched what happened, and that was a game changer. The next day, I showed back up, and we immediately started going into mission planning to go over to Afghanistan. Within 15 days, we were on our way there. So really impressive, or an impressionable time for all of us, right? It's we just watched the towers go down. There was a lot of emotion. Somebody attacked us. Most of us couldn't have pointed to Afghanistan on a map, but now that was all of a sudden our focus. So yeah, it's that's what happened after 9/11. And in October of 2001, we were in country, and our first mission was October 19th. So 20 years ago, 2 days ago, when we parachuted into Objective Rhino to take over that piece of real estate.
Wow, 20 years. Pause on your personal career, but 20 years later, just kind of thoughts on how everything ended.
Can I say shit show?
Yes, you can.
It's a national embarrassment. It's I don't like getting into a blame game, but we made, at the national level, we made some very bad decisions, and we put people at risk.
Yep.
Not just our own people. We lost 12 Marines and a sailor, which is tragic. Lots of people who partnered with us for decades, people who risked their lives to support us for decades in that country, were assassinated. That burden falls on our national leaders. Nobody can defend that to me.
No, that's fair. I don't think there's anything that there's much to disagree with there. You mentioned a moment ago, reference to Vietnam, operational and tactical successes versus strategic failures. And, 20 years in Afghanistan is the prime example of all that. You could argue we probably should have learned some better lessons, but different discussion for a different day. So you're in Afghanistan at the very beginning with all the skills that you have as a Air Force combat controller. Was the traffic controller one that came in the most in the beginning of the war in Afghanistan?
Well, that's exactly it. It's so let's play this out over a career. While we got to go do some neat things, going to do our job full force, the plug always got pulled just before you were supposed to go. And a good example is I was on an airplane spun up in 1994. I think it was July of 1994. I was going to jump into Haiti. Former President Jimmy Carter got involved. That mission went away while we were rolling down the runway. So we were used to those types of things happening. You're always spinning up for the big thing, and very rarely does it happen. So as 9/11 was happening, we knew we would go do something. We just didn't know what that would look like. So we planned for a lot of things. And the thing that we planned for was, the initial hit on Objective Gecko, which was Mullah Omar's place, that had to happen. To get the people there had to be a stopping point on the way, or actually on the way back to get fuel. So we parachuted into Objective Rhino. We surveyed that in a single period of darkness. It's the first time that had been done since the Iran hostage, Objective Eagle Claw. Mm-hmm. And that's what we did. It was a really cool mission. The Rangers did, a phenomenal job on the ground. The combat controllers and PJs, we went out and we surveyed the geography of the landscape. And then we also tested the penetration ability of the ground, because when airplanes land, they put a lot of pressure on the ground. And that's a unique skill that combat control has. There's nobody else in U.S. Special Operations Command that can do what combat controllers do. There's overlap in insertion methods, but when you get on the ground, nobody does what we do. So it's really cool to go do that live, in your career. And from there, we then proved the concept that it can be done. And the command then went, we need to do this more, because there's lots of places in southern Afghanistan that we can be penetrating. Right after that mission, I went on a 10-day recce mission where we serviced different landing zones. We surveyed and actually landed airplanes in different landing zones where we were bringing in helicopters that would then go out and destroy a bunch of shit, come back, rearm, refuel, go back out and destroy more things, come back, pack up, and we'd go home. So that was a really cool opportunity as well.
It's insane. Did you get a sense when you got there how long you were going to be there for the first time? I mean, in Afghanistan for the first time?
No, not at all. I will tell you, up to that point, special operations had become really comfortable in doing 72-hour to 2-week missions, right? We go do something, come home, and we were special, just ask us. So, when 9/11 happened, we went over, I think our first deployment, we were there for about 60 days. They brought us home and sent over another team. And then after that started, 90-day to 180-day rotations, and you watch that sustain for 20 years. There was no way I believed that was going to happen. Professionally, I didn't see that we were going to go flood Afghanistan with a whole lot of people. I thought we would continue doing low intensity conflict type missions while we were in Afghanistan. But that turned into a whole beast that I never believed it would have.
I mean, I'll ask the question bluntly, but were any of the units you're associated with at that time charged with finding bin Laden, or were you just more about infiltration and staging and positioning, things of that nature?
Yeah. So the early days of the war was about sending a message, right? Going and killing the people who planned. So that first 60 days, that's what that was about. We very quickly pivoted to going after bin Laden and spent, I was there. So for the next 5 years, the unit I was in, that was their mission. And a third of our unit was deployed forward, really all the way up until July 4th of this year. But during my time at that unit, for the next 5 years, a third of our unit was deployed. And the specific mission was to go after UBL and capture or kill it.
How much prior to, and I guess it's a big picture question, but how much prior to Afghanistan, I know you guys always work in a joint environment, but you never really had a reason to be in a joint environment like you did in Afghanistan. Was that a difficult transition?
Yeah, so I'm not sure your statement is completely accurate. The reason for us to be in the joint environment was to bring to bear our skill sets. Again, nobody does what we do. So I've been working with SF and SEALs and Rangers for my whole career. And the reason is what we did when we got on the ground. The Rangers would go out and they would pull security and kill things. We would run an airfield. We'd be out with the Army or the Navy, and we would do long haul communications, which a lot of people can do, but we did it because we had the radios that we were also talking to airplanes on. So that was the reason, and it was validated. We had people all over the world with those teams doing stuff. What Afghanistan was, it was an awakening moment where the country went, we need more of this, because once we started getting in Afghanistan and really chasing down bad guys, they basically said, if you don't have a combat controller assigned to a team, that team can't leave the wire because the asymmetric nature of bringing in airplanes to bear. So it just, our mission exploded. Matter of fact, I was a team sergeant at that time, and we would have a meeting every other day about, hey, you got a new tasking to send more people, and one person means everything in a small unit. And we were playing people Tetris all the time on making sure we could fill all the billets, because every day or every other day we'd get a new tasking for one or two more guys.
It's incredible. So, I mean, obviously the lengths of your deployment, you said, were 90 to 120 days. I mean, are you, for the next 20 years, so to speak, or however long you stayed in, were you 120 days on, 120 days off kind of deal?
No, so our units typically had three, we'll call it platoons for the audience here. We call them flights, but three platoons in them, and one platoon was gone all the time. So you had a team gone, a team in workup, and a team in recovery.
Right.
So that's about how it would work. And they start off at 90, and then they went to 120, and then they went to 180, and 180 sustained for probably 15 to 20 years. It just makes sense to have people there that long because it reduces the amount of turnover, and you get more time in country, which buys down risk for you.
All right. So, as you mentioned before, you're deployed with Chapman for Roberts Ridge, and that whole battle attack or GAR. I guess I'm kind of questioning, or at least I'm trying to understand over the nature of combat from when we get there in 2001 to something that was more, a better way to phrase it, just, like a notable battle in 2003. I mean, the sustained level of fighting that you're doing is what? Because it seems to, after, once you got in the beginning of 2002, things seemed to slow a little bit, no? Unless in the special ops community, it was different.
Yeah, it didn't slow down for us. As a matter of fact, it sped up. So I want to be clear. I wasn't with John when he was deployed.
Right.
John and I were on opposite rotations. John went in after I did, and then I came in right after him. As a matter of fact, I relieved his position a couple months later. So it sped up, and the reason it sped up is the change of leadership. So we had General Daly, who was in charge of the command at the time, and General Stan McChrystal came in, and he went, yeah, we're doing this different. And we went from doing a couple missions a week to a couple missions a night. And it was all about understanding that Al Qaeda had a very flat asymmetric network, and they were moving, and they didn't have to prepare to do things for us. They were just always on the move. We had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to stay in up to their pace. And John McChrystal changed that. He changed the planning cycle to, from 72 hours to once you hit the ground, you start planning again. And we went from hitting a target, and then coming back and recovering and assessing what happened to hitting the target and assessing what's going on the ground and hitting another target right from there. He just sped everything up so that the pace picked up. It didn't slow down for us.
Yeah, I mean, the scope of this is starting to get just beyond me, at least my comprehension of it. So when, and again, I'm not focusing necessarily on anything with Chapman. I'm just in the big picture, that sort of environment, kinetic environment that you guys are in back and forth. Do you actually feel like you're making any progress at all?
A couple steps forward, a couple steps back, right? So when your job is to chop off the head of the snake, and the snake has multiple heads and grows new heads as quick as you chop them off. The targeting and going, okay, here's where I'm going after. You had some very good tactical successes. So once you identified who you had to go get, you would go get him and either capture, kill him, and that would work. But then the fact that they were backfilling so quickly and it didn't really disrupt their operations. At that level, you go, man, we're doing a lot of good stuff, but are we disrupting what's going on? Over time, you could see the disruption, but in the immediate moment, you couldn't. It did feel a bit overwhelming, I would say.
Are there times where you can think of in battles in Afghanistan where you guys didn't have a decided advantage or your job was made tougher because of X, Y, or Z?
I would say when we actually got into the mission, we always had the advantage. We had well-trained people. They were professionals who've been doing it for decades. You had NVGs, you had air power, which always gives you an advantage that nobody else can duplicate. So in that sense, no, we had the advantage. Where you became at a disadvantage is when they said, hey, we're going to put a small team out here and you got to stand up an operating post. And you got guys living out of a Sealand container and your only security is the dirt mound that you built around it. During those times, it gets a bit sporty.
So what's it like? I mean, is there a situation where you can think of where you're trying to direct air in support of ground troops because of the terrain in Afghanistan, like it couldn't happen or you weren't sure? Like, I mean, because for you, obviously at this point, this is your first real foray into combat, as you'd mentioned earlier. And the difference between what you did in Desert Storm and here, is it like night and day?
Oh, it absolutely was different, that different. But we also had technology. At the time, we had really good imagery that we were able to carry around on computers, right, which allowed us to, like, even when you're in a gunfight, it's not like the movies, right? You're aside of maybe Black Hawk Down, where there was a lot of maneuvering and you were in close proximity. When you're in the mountains of Afghanistan, you're having a gunfight. There's actually time to take an assessing of what do we got here. And guys would actually pull up their computers and go, hey, here's what it looks like where we are. Here's what it looks like where they are. And you'd be talking to airplanes and getting their eyes on target. So while it was difficult, you had the ability to do your job. There were times, and don't get me wrong, where you were heads down and you were just surviving. I didn't necessarily have that in those early days of the war.
I'm trying to grasp the toughest part of your job in day-to-day operations because you do so many things. Again, I know you talk about the air traffic control and being the major part of it, or maybe the most important part of it, but I'm trying to put you in the fight in my mind as best I can with my understanding of the SOF community and fit it in there. Is there, am I missing something, or is there a better way to explain it?
No. So there's a couple things. First off, what's expected of you is the volume of it is incredible. You're not just going through a door and turning left to right and decide to shoot or not shoot. You're doing that because you're with the team and you have to. But you have to maintain 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional awareness really all the time in what's going on. That is very difficult. I will tell you, the young guys were very impressive because they would be in the back of a vehicle they'd be manning a gun. They'd have a computer here. They'd be talking to airplanes and stacking them up. They'd have stack of 3 or 4 deep airplanes, talking to them all while they're listening in one ear to airplanes, they're listening in the other ear to the ground force commander. Those are all very difficult parts of their job. Here's the most difficult part of being a combat controller, in my opinion. A guy graduates the combat control school and becomes a combat controller after 2 years of training. He gets to the unit. He's got 6 months to train up to deploy. And what that means is he's getting his JTAC rating, the ability to drop bombs on targets. He's also doing terrain study for the FOB he's going to go to, the forward operating base. And when he gets there, he has never trained with that team, whether it's a SEAL team or a Special Forces team or a Ranger team or a MARSOC team or a coalition force, right? We had guys out with the British SAS and the Australian SAS and the Dutch, and you show up and you're the new guy. Typically, they don't know your name for the first 3 months. They just call you Air Force. However, you get on the ground and you can be in a firefight within 4 hours, which the stories of that are numerous. Like guys get on the ground and like, hey man, there's a vehicle, get in, let's go. So now you're in a firefight, and when you're getting pinned down and they want to bring in air, the ground force commander typically says something like this: blow that fucking building up now. My guys are getting shot and I'm losing dudes. So you have all this pressure on you. Not only do you have to know how to talk to the airplanes and communicate what the ground force commander's intent is, you have to understand all the rules of engagement, where you can drop bombs, when you can drop bombs, what type of bombs that plane has on it, how to best employ them. Those are the difficult parts of the job. Doing it while getting shot at and getting yelled at by somebody from another service who probably doesn't even know your name at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you describe it so eloquently. It makes me look like a job that I really want. Not, but that said, it's impressive to say the least. And I don't think, unless you've been there, I don't think people understand when you say, the 4 dimensions of the battlefield. That's a real thing. And most people,
that's right.
I would tell you, most good people in combat have trouble seeing beyond 2, because it's just, it requires so much of your depth. It requires so much of your brain and your bandwidth that your mind can handle to be able to work in those fashions. To be able to do it on a 4th level it's above me. I mean, I wouldn't even try.
Yeah. Like I will tell you, I was an okay combat controller. Our best combat controllers can take all that information. They're watching the battlefield. They're watching the space. They're listening to 2 different people talking their earset or headset, and they're nailing it. Like they're just all the time. For me, there were times I just had to sit back and go, okay, I need a second. Let me think, because I got to figure out how to do my job in this environment. It's a quite challenging job. And that scenario I just expressed to you, remember, that guy is 20 years old and he's probably an E4, right? So when you show up to a special forces team where the lowest ranking guy's an E5, right? And that guy probably got promoted just out of SFQC, and he's, he'll be an E7 in 2 years. We send our young guys into very difficult environments, and they're not with their own team. The SF guys train together and go to war together. The SEALs train together and go to war together. We send onesies and twosies out with people they've never met to go fight a war for 7 months or 6 months at a time.
Should that change? Should they give the individual more rank when they first start and give a little more training, or they're just trained to handle it regardless?
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm not sure rank does much for you. Like
Sure.
I understand the debate, but it's I think we do a good job of training and preparing our guys mentally for what they do. And what happens in our pipeline is that we always talk about the joint environment. We don't talk about, hey, you got to go do this thing. We go, you got to do this thing, and don't forget who you're with. And they don't understand what you're doing, so you got to make sure they can understand it. You got to be able to do your job, because if you go down, you're the only guy. And that's what happened with John Chapman. So John was up there with, Britt Slabitsky, who I know, and the rest of the guys. I want to say there was about five or six of them. When John went down, they lost that advantage. They no longer could bring air power to bear. And that is a big part of that story. So yeah, it's the uniqueness of what combat control does may not hit the streets, or people may not digest it really well until they lose it. And then when they lose it, they go, holy shit. So yeah, I hope that helps.
No, it does. I mean, it makes a lot more sense, at least in the context of what I know about Tacker Gar and why that's so pivotal. You had four different combat jumps. You said 3 in Afghanistan. When did your first one happen?
So October 19th, 2001 was the first one.
Okay.
And I use a different term, although they're technically called combat jumps. I call them clandestine jumps. So I I was shooting my gun while I was coming down, or I was getting shot at while I hit the ground, like the guys in World War II, right? That was a different version of combat jump, or even Grenada, where the planes were getting shot at. We went in, and our job was to be undetected, and then do our mission. So I offer that. It's a nuance, but it's an important nuance to me. So October 19th, 2001 was the first one. It was Objective Rhino in support of Objective Gecko to make sure that we could take care of Mullah Omar. After that, the command said, hey, we need more of this. I went out and did that tactical recce for 10 days, came back, and I walk into the ops center, and my name is on the board for a military free fall jump into Afghanistan. And, anybody who's been in this community a while goes, hey, those things go away really quickly. So I just put my head down. I didn't talk to anybody. I just started packing my gear because I didn't want to.
What was your first thought, though?
Do any bad mojo. Holy shit, this is cool. And especially since I just come back from the schoolhouse, right? I'm on a team with guys who've been on the road for the past 4 years. I come in and all of a sudden I'm on this mission that is the mission of a lifetime, right?
Right. So, but just clarify real quick, the first combat jump on October 19th in 01, that wasn't a halo jump?
No, that was a static line. There was, a couple hundred people there. You don't do halos with hundreds of people.
Right.
That's a recipe for disaster.
I didn't know that there were, different types of insertions, I guess, that they used you guys for. I thought there was one standard way that you would go in.
No. So I did that first jump, and I went on that tactical recce. While I was on that tactical recce, there were other static line jumps that had gone in to different airfields, and those were the airfields that we serviced while I was on the ground.
Gotcha. Okay.
So when I came out, they said, hey, we don't want to relive Mogadishu where we kept doing the same TTPs because that's why they were able to shoot down our helicopter. So we said, okay, this time we're going to do a military free fall. And we went up to 10,000 feet. And we didn't believe it was going to happen. The whole time we thought, there's no way this jump's going to happen. They're not going to let us do it.
How many of you are there? 4 or 5?
Well, there was a handful of Rangers from the Regimental Recon Detachment, and then there were a handful of combat controllers, and we had a pararescueman with us as well.
I'm excited to hear. I'm excited for you because I knew a couple of Green Berets who were trying like hell just to go to Halo school because it's incredibly tough to get this school itself, let alone actually have a Halo jump into combat.
Yeah, no, it was a really cool opportunity. And a good anecdotal story is one of my teammates. So when you're doing a Halo jump, there's certain checks you do before they open the door to make sure none of your parachute's hanging out. And at the 10-minute mark, they gave the check, and you lean forward and you look at your teammate's pins to make sure nothing's popped out. And the guy sitting next to me, I said, hey man, your parachute popped out. And he looked down. He didn't hear me. He thought it was my parachute. His response was, sucks to be you. Because what that means is you're not jumping now. They're going to tie you in. Well, once I conveyed to him that it was his chute, he took all his stuff off, repacked his stuff there in the aircraft, and got it back on in time to get out of the airplane. Wow. And it was just an amazing thing to watch. He's one of the best operators I ever worked with. He's just very agile and versatile, and he did a great job. But yeah, the ramp came down, and I went, holy crap, this is actually going to happen. And we got out. It was really dark, so you could barely see the other guys with their chem lights on their parachutes, and hit the ground. And in that period of darkness, we were in a place where no planes had ever landed before, and we had to go find our starting point and then create a runway where a runway didn't exist and survey it to make sure it worked. That took most of the night. Before sunrise, we went into a hide site. Just like any other mission, you're pulling security half the time while you're there. Then the next evening, darkness came. We set up the airfield with IR lights, landed an airplane, and we handed it off to some of my teammates. They got off the plane and they went out and did the mission. We got on the plane and went home. That's the first time that mission had ever been done.
Wow. I'm not going to let you gloss over the actual jump itself. You just said, yeah, the plane opened up and I landed on the ground. Yeah, no shit. I assumed as such, but there's a whole lot of emotions and things that go on in between. So from that standpoint, now, I mean, one, I just never having skydived before. I assume it's incredibly hard to land in a very specific spot with all the factors, the wind and everything else, and how high you are during broad daylight. At night, I mean, Are you wearing nods on this jump? Like, how is just talk me through while you're falling from 10,000 feet, like everything that you're processing.
So today they do wear them, but back then we weren't allowed. Like we weren't allowed to train that way. So you don't fight like you don't train. So we just went, hey, Um, we'd never jump with nods. So, you leave the plane, I want to say it was 9 or 11% illumination. So there wasn't much light out. And you're trying to stay as you're following next to the guy who went out ahead of you. So you can see the chem light, you're just trying to follow with him. I actually had some of my equipment had shifted and I was in a slight turn. So as my body's trying to turn right, I'm shifting my body to stop the turn. And that takes, mental energy. So I'm doing okay. Got to make sure I'm staying flat and stable. Then we get to open the altitude. I open my chute. Because you can't really see each other that well, there's just a lot of this. You're hearing parachutes flutter and people coming across you. Then we finally get into a stack. I stacked behind one of my teammates, and we landed a little bit further out than everybody else. Everybody else landed over here. We got on the ground, got our stuff up, and hightailed it over to the team, and they got our stuff together. So it was, for me, it was a bit of a sporty jump.
I mean, how do you know? I assume you have an altimeter, but how do you know how close you are to the ground? Is that all you're looking at?
Well, you are looking at your altimeter, and it's training comes into play, right? You've been doing this your whole career, so that comes into play. You also, when you're parachuting, whether it's static line or free fall, your rucksack is tied to a tether, and you at a certain point you let it go when you know you're done making turns, because if you let it go too early, the pendulum kind of messes with your steering. But when you know you're on a straight final course, you let your parachute or you let your rucksack down. It sits at a 15-foot distance from your feet. So when you hear that hit, that's when you start flaring so that you don't smash into the ground.
That makes sense. All right. Now, yeah, all these years of experience, obviously, you talk to it through so simply. It's just it's not. It's harder for me to comprehend that. The final two jumps that you did, the other one in Afghanistan, one in Iraq, they were static line or were they free fall?
No, they were static line. So the other one in Afghanistan, by this point, was a fairly routine jump. It was, hey, we need guys to get out there. I happen to be available and not injured, so they put me on the jump. The Iraq one is a funny story. So I was out with some SEALs doing a reconnaissance looking for a POW at the time. I got back. I got off an airplane, and my commander met me at the tail of the airplane. He says, hey, you're jumping tomorrow night. You need to go get sleep. I said, well, I probably need to go plan this mission. He said, nope, I'm telling you to go get some sleep because you're jumping in 12 hours. So I went and got a little bit of sleep, went into the ops center, did some final planning. And we were jumping in H-1 airfield in the Western Iraq. What we were trying to do is open up Western Iraq by bringing in forces so we come straight across. And that was pretty neat. Again, I all of my parachute jumps were with 3rd Ranger Battalion or Regimental Recon Detachment. So I have a tight relationship with that organization, especially back then because we all knew each other. So it's just another operation I went on with them.
Because your mission is so unique and different. I mean, you're doing all these jumps, but are you ever actually in regular ground combat throughout your career?
Define regular ground combat.
Just, I mean, you essentially, if I'm understanding you correctly, like you're jumping into open spaces where nobody is because you have to land a plane. So sure, I mean, I'm sure that there are times that you got engaged by the enemy there, but are you ever in a situation where your sole mission is just ground combat?
Well, a lot of times in the early days of the war, it was very specific going after to capture somebody.
Right.
As the war evolved over time, we had, I can't remember, the village stability operations. So we would put guys in the field and they were there to help do foreign internal defense. And by nature of being there, you're now a target. So you're getting into combat that way. There's not a whole lot of like a normal infantry unit, you're doing line on line combat. It's usually very surgically planned out missions, but a lot of ground combat. If you look at the 6 Air Force crosses we earned, aside of John Chapman's Medal of Honor, those were guys that were close in fights with the enemy. Many of them planned, whether they were in the flat desert or in the mountains of Afghanistan.
I mean, I guess I'm just trying to ascertain from your point of view, is one more difficult or more challenging than the other? I mean, you seem to make all the jumps seem routine and the same. So I don't know if that part is harder, but is it harder being engaged in the enemy in ground combat, or do you feel more secure? Do you feel like your job is easier jumping out of an airplane?
No, I don't think those make it easier or harder. Those are just kind of ways to get to work, whether you're in a convoy or you're walking or you're riding motorcycles, whatever those things are. Those are just ways to work. It's once you get there, what do you do? In some ways, Special Operations Community has it easier because they have assets and they have high levels of training, and everybody is very vested in being there, right? So when you're working with a tier 1 or a tier 2 unit, sometimes when you're working with a conventional unit, people may not be as motivated or as trained or as capable. So, but what you have there is you have mass numbers and a lot of other resources that are brought to bear. So I never really looked at it, is this mission harder than that mission? I looked at it from the perspective of what do I have to do and how do I buy down risk for myself and the force? The last set of missions I went on, I was working in the ops center in Balad Air Base, and we had a British force that was working with our command. And the boss came out and he said, hey, these guys are out there doing good stuff, but they're not using air appropriately. Could you go down there and advise them on what's going on? So I'm an E8 at this point. I'm not supposed to be out on the front lines with guys. I said, sure, I'll go down. Not that I get a choice. When the general tells you to do it, you're doing it. So I go pack my stuff. And one of the things that we teach combat controllers all the time is you never go anywhere without your radios programmed. So I'm getting my radios programmed despite going down for what I think is an administrative job. I get on the ground. I meet these guys like, hey, that's your seat. So what do you mean? They're like, yeah, we're going on a mission in 4 hours. You're in that seat in the Humvee. And within 4 hours of getting on the ground with dudes I've never met, I'm now going out and doing missions. And I think the third mission we went on, we were getting shot at as soon as we hit the ground. So I think that kind of fits into your category of, right. Holy shit, I'm now in a firefight that was unplanned. And I'm right next to the ground force commander, and we're letting the battle evolve. And at some point he says, hey man, I want bombs dropped. I said, well, you got to pull your guys back because they're too close to the building you want me to kill. So we went through that evolution, and ultimately we destroyed that building with all the bad guys in it.
When you say we went through that evolution, that seems like it's code for we had a disagreement.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was just I was explaining to him what had to happen, and that just takes time, right? Like it's not in the movies where somebody just touches their ear set and says, "Hey, everybody, back off." There's a lot of people moving, a lot of noise. Everybody was their own opinion. So, yeah, it took a little while to get people pulled back into a safe distance that I was comfortable with. Interestingly on that, what I wanted was an AC-130 because it's a very surgical platform, but all I had was F-16. So I start talking them on. They finally get their eyes on. I actually have them on short final. They're ready to drop, and the AC-130 checks on. I'm like, okay, knock it off. The F-16s, I send them up to altitude. They're mad because they really wanted to be the ones dropping the bombs. AC-130 got talked on, and they did a phenomenal job. They very surgically hit that house with no collateral damage. So we were lucky to have that happen.
Yeah, I can imagine if you're an F-16 pilot, you tell him to back off. He's pretty pissed at that point in time.
Well, especially since he was nose down, like he was coming in on his run.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, he was amped up. But again, that's what a combat controller gets paid to do. We go, all right, I could drop a 500 or 1,000 pounder here, or I could put a 105 through the front window. 105 howitzer is the right weapon for that mission.
Was there ever a time where you got into a fight with or a disagreement with somebody on the ground who said I needed air and, or X, Y, and Z couldn't happen? I mean, are those rare occurrences?
There was a mission I went on. It was actually 2 days prior to that mission, and that we had competing targets. And the guy controlling air, who wasn't a combat controller, on the other target, he was very, we'll say, selfishly using that asset, and I needed it, and that turned into a pissing contest. And that after action is always pretty colorful as well.
Who won?
Well, he kept the asset. So fortunately, I never actually needed to drop bombs.
Gotcha. Okay.
But in the after action, the ground force commander went, yeah, we're not doing that again. When this guy asked you for the airplane, you sent it over to him because we needed him to do reconnaissance on both targets. This guy thought he saw something, so I pushed the aircraft to him. He just then didn't want to give him back. And that's a human thing. Like you have it, it's comfort for you. So you just try to keep it, but he was making a bad decision that evening.
I mean, was there ever a time where you couldn't get air quick enough or you couldn't get assets quick enough that you can remember?
Not for me. A lot of guys who work for me had those problems. And unfortunately people die because of that happening, but it never happened for me. But it is common to be in a firefight and go, hey, I need this. And somebody who's got a bigger picture says, no, we're moving this asset over here. One of the things that we try to do is spend, as you're doing a train up to go overseas, the ground force wants you with them all the time. And we would say, no, we're not doing that. We're going to send our guys out to Vegas to do training with the pilots, because the pilots start getting a vested interest. And when they go, hey, I know that's Michael Lamonica on the ground, they will help influence those decisions.
Oh, wow.
But to your question, absolutely. Numerous stories of our guys being on the ground, needing something and not getting what they needed.
I mean, that's got to be, there's a sense that you're like, the angel on their shoulder, right? You're the one savior that they can get the leverage and the initiative back in combat.
That's right. You can go back to Roberts Ridge where that happened multiple times, where people on the ground were asking for stuff that somebody chose not to send, and people died because of it. You can go back to Mogadishu as well. If we'd had AC-130s over Mogadishu, a lot of that stuff wouldn't have happened, because those combat controllers could have been very surgically taken out key nodes. But, again, national leadership at that time chose not to do that. And that put our guys in a bad situation.
What do you suppose that is? Like, what, I mean, and again, we've had 20 years of combat, right? So I think we understand it a little bit better. Mogadishu, I certainly understood at the time, because we're just, we hadn't really fought. I mean, we didn't need it as much, at least publicly, right? The perception is we didn't need it in the Gulf War, because we just overran them with tanks, and it wasn't even breaking a sweat, and we hadn't anything since Vietnam. But why? Just spitball an opinion or an idea. Why would DOD or Washington be so reluctant to support with air power to any given mission?
Well, it's politics. A lot of it is, how does it look when it hits the news? And there's also experience. Like, when you look at our political landscape right now, post World War II, I want to say 70 or 80% of those people had military experience. Right now, it's less than 1%. So they don't truly understand what they're doing.
Right.
Is that their fault or not? I don't know the answer to that, but there's a lot of politics. And even with general officers, there was I can't recall his name right now, but there's a general officer who was an Air Force officer back during, the Battle of Trafalgar, that didn't make some decisions. And a lot of people question, was he prepared to be in that environment? And there are a fair amount of people that say, no, that's why you need a ground force commander running that, not an Air Force officer who doesn't really understand what's happening on top of that mountain. I never dug into it that much, but there's a lot of opinions out there about that.
How hard is it to grasp, I guess, the gap between what is going on the ground, and like, because you see it, like, you're on the ground with combat, and so you get a better view than people sitting back in an operations center, or even people sitting back in a rear support area, whatever it is, who may make these decisions. Are there conversations you would have ahead of time with certain leaders and certain people to let them understand that, or gain their trust and say, look, when I call for this, I need it, and they trusted you enough to trust your judgment?
Yeah, the specific conversations didn't have to happen.
Right.
Most of our leaders, I would tell you, understood I can't run the battle from the operations center. They did a really good job of observing and making sure that the people on the ground were supported. But there were key times throughout my career where I watched the opposite happen, where somebody goes, I know better. I used to do that. Why didn't you guys turn left when you went into that room instead of turning right? Why didn't you go to this building first? A lot of second guessing. But that was unique to certain personalities. I think most of our officer corps in the joint community did a pretty good job of going, hey, these guys are on the ground. I have direct line of communication, and let me take in information and let me try to help them where I can help them.
24 years. Is there any particular moment that stands out to you over others? Whether it's, calling for fire, there was the Halo jump, whatever it may be. I mean, is there like sort of a personal ranking of moments that stand out for you as the best?
Well, we talked about many of them, right? So when I'm sitting in a classroom and an instructor looks around and goes, 5 of you are going to make it, Lamonica, you're not one. That one stands out. As a matter of fact, most of the guys that are in the room that I still know today, we recall that every time we get together. Graduating for me was a big deal. Going to war the first time was big. 9/11 was clearly a big moment in everybody's lives. October 19th, 2001, jumping into Afghanistan was big. The free fall jump was big. The time I went out with the Brits, that was another big one, right? Because I didn't know those guys. 4 hours earlier, we'd never met. Before you know it, I'm on missions with them. As I look back at my career, the biggest thing about the career is the people. It's you spend an entire career around some pretty awesome people, and you go through some very unique experiences, and they make you better. So yeah, there's a lot of things that I look back on my career and the greatness that I drew from it, and it's all those things we've talked about today.
When you decided to retire, what was the reason? Were you just done, or the Air Force said, see you later? How did it all come to pass?
It was a pretty simple decision. My oldest daughter has cerebral palsy, and we knew she needed a big surgery. And one night I came home, my wife was a physician's assistant, so she understands the medical really well. She said, hey, we're not going to get her the care she needs by moving every 2 years. So it's time. I went to my boss the next day and said, hey, I'm retiring. They all did what they're supposed to do, which is try to talk me out of it. I said, unless you're going to take care of my daughter for me, that's not going to happen. So pretty simple. We moved to Colorado, best doctor on the planet, did the surgery for her and took care of her. I would have liked to have done 30 years because I love the way I did. I felt for the 24 that I was in, I was doing the job that I was built to do. Could I have gone and been a SEAL? Sure. Could I have been an SF guy? Sure. I was made to be a combat controller. It was, it fulfilled everything I needed in my life, and I loved it. One of the unique things about my job and my personal experiences in the opening days of Afghanistan and Iraq, I was every other night jumping back and forth between working with the Army and the Navy. So I wasn't attached to one team. There were so few of us that when those guys would go out and they needed one of us, for us, it was just a rotation. Hey, you just came off this mission, you're going on this one tomorrow. So I was just going back and forth between that. And that's pretty rewarding when you go out there and you're working with the nation's best, all the people in special operations, and you're dealing with the challenges of working with different folks every night. It's just a really cool part of our job.
Do we need more combat controllers?
Yes, absolutely. We had barely enough to get us through the 20 years we had. When you think of aligning forces with all the different theaters around the world, there's not enough of them. There isn't. Is
it a recruiting issue? Is it actually a skill set issue? I mean,
well, it's the Air Force. So the Air Force limits the numbers you can have. So let me put this in perspective. Combat control has been around since 1953. Before all the other special operations forces, combat control has been a thing since 1953. Across all time, as of July of this year, there are 3,700 combat controllers across all time. Today, there's probably 4,000 or 5,000 SEALs active duty. There's probably 7,000 or 8,000 special forces active duty. We have 3,700 all time. The Air Force needs more of them. The joint community needs more of them. But it's a matter of, do you have enough positions to fill people into? Most of my career, we were about 70% manned. As I was retiring, we got up into the 90s, and we've increased our manpower. So if you have the billets, you can recruit to them and train to them.
Are you okay with the way special operations now has a light shown on it the way it never did before in the pre-9/11 world?
I think some people put themselves out there too much. And in doing so, they pass on things they probably shouldn't. But that community has done a lot in the past 20 years. They did a whole ton before that. I'm not so concerned about people understanding what they do and the impact they have. My bigger concern is the toll that it has taken on that force. Like, there are guys who I put through combat control school. They graduated a month after, October 19th when I jumped in, and all they've known is fighting a war. And those guys are still in. They've been fighting a war for the past 20 years. That takes a toll on the individuals, and culturally it takes a toll on the force. As we're starting to wind down the wars, the things that Combat Control Association and Foundation are focused on is working with the active duty, saying, hey, what are you guys seeing? How are you taking care of it? What can't you take care of? So where do we come in? And for us, it's really about the rapid response. We get a call probably once every 2 or 3 months that says, hey, Joey's having a hard time, either domestic issues or substance abuse issues of some sort, or PTSD. And we come in and we go, okay, what can we do? Because the VA can't turn fast enough. We'll put money up front immediately and get that person to where they need to be to help them work through what they're dealing with.
You mentioned the Combat Control Association, Combat Controller Foundation. How did it come to pass that you ended up on the president or as the president of the board of both those organizations?
Well, the association has been around for decades, late 70s. And I got elected to the board. And once I was on the board members asked me to be the president. And it was quite an honor, given the people that are in my community. The foundation really got created right around the same time because an association, the way it raises money is it reaches out to members and says, hey, Joey got hurt. We need to take care of Joey. And it's very much this internal way of raising funds. And we said, no, we got to do better than this. We can't just be taking care of guys reactionary. So we stood up the foundation as our fundraising arm. And just this year, we really started getting traction as far as hosting fundraisers and making real money that allows us to now look at guys and go, hey, here's what we're going to do for the squadrons that are active duty. Here's what we're going to do for guys who are injured. Here's what we're going to do for wives and children who need help. So we're just now pivoting and taking full advantage of what the foundation can bring to bear.
Is there a part of the schooling that you went through initially that you didn't feel like you get to do enough of? I mean, did you do a lot of diving? Did you have a chance to do that throughout your career?
We did a ton of it in training. Real world missions typically was recovery diving. So our squadrons are built with pararescuemen, and their job is to rescue people. So on those, we would dive, either try to recover bodies or recover something that was lost. To my knowledge, no combat controllers ever done a true combat dive. Okay. Very few SEALs have done true combat dives. I think when you look at the underwater aspect of the job, SEALs doing strategic reconnaissance using mini subs, that's really where it's at. That's where you get your bigger bang for the buck.
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, does it seem like almost I don't want to say wasted skill, but because they do it better, you're only supplementary to them, right? Like that's kind of the only role it has.
Yeah, it's just an insertion method. So like I said earlier, like those are just ways to get to work. And when you work with the SEALs, you have to be qualified to deploy whatever way they're doing. They can't do what we do. So it really just comes down to, are you prepared to go execute the mission? And that's what Special Operations Forces are all about.
What's the part you miss the most about it?
People in the mission. And while the mission was awesome, I don't miss living in hangars or tents all the way around the world in dusty areas. But the people, they just across all the services, one of the things that people will ask me all the time, who's better? Who's the best? There is no better or best. There are a lot of good humans who go through very difficult schools to be really good at what they do, and they spend a career doing it. I've got great friends across the entire SOF community that I continue to hang out with today or communicate with today. Being around them it re-energizes you.
Is there anything that you would change either about the training pipeline or what they do now versus what they did when you came in?
No, the pipeline's better now. It's actually really impressive that the things that they pay attention to, they recruit guys very specifically, which they didn't do. They now have people who their job is to take recruits and work with them to the point where they go, okay, this guy is ready to ship for basic training. While they're in basic training, they have their own unique basic training flights where it's all combat controllers, pararescuemen, and TAC-Ps. So they're all going to basic training together, and they're getting special food and physical training aspects there. Then when they get to the training pipeline, all these things that they're measuring, whether heart rate, temperature, VO2 max, all these things, they're really able to baseline what good operators look like and pay attention to them and follow them physically throughout their career. The training pipeline, while the order has changed a little bit, is largely the same as when I went through. They do a lot better job preparing them, but the actual qualification course is the same course.
Gotcha.
So there's not much I would change. I think it's a tried and true.
No, and again, I only ask just because a lot of the other special ops communities, whether it's Green Berets or SEALs or whatever, even to a certain extent, Rangers, there's been a slight change, at least in the mentality with which they approach the training and the assessment and selection of these individuals. But some of that has been based off of the fact that through 20 years of combat, we needed more Green Berets, we needed more SEALs because we asked them to do more than we ever have before. And so there was a little bit of, streamlining in the process, if you will, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's all bullshit. Like, it's always harder when I went through, right? Yeah. I'll tell you what the guys go through now is harder than when I went through. I visited the site last year, and I looked around and went, I might not have made it through this course. Just the way they're measuring things and all the things that are expected of them. And I think that's across the board. I think a lot of guys get really tied to my class was tough, and you wouldn't have made it to my class, and okay, whatever. I don't think any one pipeline's harder than the other. I don't think the guys that went through after me had an easier time than I did. We produce a lot of really good humans in our specific career fields, and they do great stuff, and I'm proud of them, and America's lucky to have them.
Did any of your other fellow combat controllers end up being killed in action or anything like that?
Being who?
End up being killed in action or anything like that, or wounded?
Oh yeah, I've got 19 teammates who died in action, and
wow.
Our job is to celebrate their lives and take care of their families.
I mean, maybe it's because you make it seem so effortless. And again, obviously, John Chapman, he was stuck on the side of a mountain. It's different. There was enemy that generally you're not alone, outnumbered on the side of a mountain, and you might be outnumbered, but the way you describe it makes it seem like those situations aren't that prevalent. Is that sort of generally these guys ended up in spots where they somehow normally weren't supposed to be?
No, it's very prevalent. I don't have those same experiences. I happen to be lucky, although I got to go to combat frequently. There are some guys who spent an entire career under the gun. I was just down at an event down in Texas, and I was with Ishbiegas. He's a senior master sergeant now. He earned 2 silver stars. That doesn't happen because he was in an easy environment. Rob Gutierrez, who by all accounts should be a Medal of Honor recipient. The guys that were on the ground will tell you he did Medal of Honor stuff while he was out there. I spent time with Rob all the time, and Rob's been in 2 events. He should have gotten an Air Force Cross for his first one 4 years prior. The guys were out there jobbing it. They were in very difficult situations. I try not to focus overly on those because while our guys are out doing great things, it's really what do we do to bring, how do we impact the fight? And that's kind of what I wanted to get across today.
No, again, I'm smarter now than I was when we started this podcast, put it that way. Go ahead.
Yeah, say you ask about the pipeline. I told you my last day at combat control school was 9/11.
Right.
The next 60 days while I was deployed looked a lot like the field training exercise at combat control school. It was really cool. So I was out there, and as we were preparing for missions, I was like, oh, this is what I put the students through 3 weeks ago. This is what I did with the students a month ago. So the training is extremely relevant, in my opinion. It's born out of combat, and it is constantly revised, but the core of the mission stays the same. And it actually made it easier for me when we were planning Afghanistan because I've never been there before, right? So I'm trying to associate the things we're doing. And I was just very easily translating it to the field training exercise that the students go through at the combat control school.
I mean, I would tend to think generally in special operations that the gap between training and reality is much smaller. At least I could tell you about the conventional Army from, when I was there. I can tell you for sure the things that we trained up on pre-mobilization and when we got on ground, it's like, yeah, that was a waste of time. We're not going to use any of that here. But I would assume in the special operations community, the gap is much smaller.
Yeah, I feel like it was.
Yeah. So, with all this, any regrets on 24 years or anything you'd want to do differently, do over again?
Oh, there's probably some personal things where I got in trouble that I might want to do over. But overall, no. I tell people all the time, if my body can handle it, I'd go do it tomorrow.
Like, you got in trouble like how? Just out of curiosity. You don't have to get into specifics.
Well,
is this like...
There may have been some alcohol involved.
I was going to say off-duty incidents.
Yeah. It was stupid young guy stuff.
That's okay. We're all guilty. Most of us, Yeah, everybody needs advice, Mike. Everybody needs advice. Yeah. If you don't have one.
And the fortunate thing for me is none of it's a secret. I got caught every time, so it's all well documented. But as you look back on a career and go, could you go undo some things? Yeah, of course, we have all made mistakes, but I'd go back and do my career all over again. And I'd advise anybody to go do it. I love being a combat controller. I think what that community does is very unique, and it's physically, intellectually, and emotionally stimulating. So it's a great job to be in.
I meant to ask you because you got out in 2011, a couple of months after we finally got bin Laden. What is a combat controller's role in that sort of mission there?
Yeah. So interestingly, the day I retired is the day they got bin Laden.
Boy, you keep starting and stopping on these significant days.
It's one of my teammates who was in the unit where we sent guys to go do that called me. He said, "We got him." I was like, "What do you mean we got him?" He's like, "We got him. Turn on the news." And I turned on the news, and it sure as shit. That was like 11 o'clock at night. Next morning is when I retired. So it was a great way to retire. So in that event, you could have a combat controller on that airplane. They didn't. The SEALs chose not to, and it was really just get more assaulters on the ground.
Right.
But you then have an offset site with a QRF, and there we had combat controllers and pararescuemen ready to go. Not only that, but they were running that airfield. Like you don't just land planes wherever you want to. So they went in, they set that up, landed airplanes, and everything launched from there. And the QRF was ready to respond. So in that scenario, you could have had a combat control on one of the helicopters. You just didn't on this one.
Wow. Amazing stuff. Well, again, 24 years clearly of a high speed, low drag, all the phrases that we use, just incredible amounts of your whole career seems kinetic. It never stopped.
Yeah, it was quite the ride. So while it was a fun ride for me, it clearly puts pressures on your family. And my wife, she's a champ. She dealt with it. She took it all in stride. She met me when we were in Germany, or we met each other when we were in Germany. So she knew what she was in for.
Did you have to not tell her where you were going and what you were doing?
There were times that when we met, when I took off for Somalia and Angola, and those were rapid deployments, and it was like, "Hey, I'm leaving." We were dating at the time. After the first 2 years, we were then engaged to be married, and she went off to PA school, and I went off to the JSOC compound. We were preparing for Haiti, and all she knew is she couldn't get a hold of me. So yeah, that puts extra stresses on the marriage.
How is your son with cerebral palsy? Your daughter?
My daughter, yeah.
Yeah. How is she doing?
She's doing great. So she had the 2 surgeries that she needed, really complex surgeries, but they did what they're supposed to do, and she's mobile still today. She just graduated high school in June. She turned 18 in July, and she runs her own business where she sells stuff on Shopify, which is kind of like an Etsy.
Yep.
So she makes stuff and sells it. She says she's not ready to go to college because they're doing that remote, and she doesn't want that experience. So she figured she'd start her own business. So it's really cool. It's fun watching her grow up.
No, that's incredible. So again, just an incredible ride. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I kind of feel energized, again, I knew what combat controllers were and sort of the scope of their job, but hearing you talk about it it's amazing. Again, as you said, there's not many of you running around. So I'm glad you could be the first one we could get here on the hazard ground, but incredible story. And thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Yeah, no, we need to connect you with Alan Yoshida and Calvin Markham and Dan Schilling and get some other folks on here talking to you. Their stories are quite incredible.
No, it is amazing. And we'd love to tell them. So we certainly appreciate your time. Again, Michael and Monica, thank you so much for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Thanks for having
us. You've been listening to Kill Cliff's Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.